In today's polarized world, discussing politics can be challenging, especially for Christians and families. The topics are loaded, emotions run high, and finding common ground can feel impossible. However, it's important to note that there are ways to navigate these conversations more effectively. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Challenging Conversations podcast, where we tackle some of the most pressing and controversial issues of our time with a biblical worldview. I'm your host, Jimenez, and if you're looking for a way to have meaningful, productive conversations about politics without all the tension and conflict, you're in the right place. Today, we have a special guest, Gabe Lyons from THINQ, who will equip you with practical strategies on how to engage in dialogue that's non-threatening when talking about politics, and that are truly beneficial for everyone involved, especially your family. So let's get into this conversation with Gabe Lyons. Gabe, it's great to have you on Challenging Conversations.
Jason, good to be with you.
Well, I know you've been through a lot these last few years, and you now have started what is known as THINQ. So just take us back to what you've been doing for the last few years and what THINQ organization is all about.
Well, for over 20 years, we've been hosting leaders through events and retreats and experiences that really try to elevate dialogue and conversation that allow people to learn from one another and allow us to hear from people that probably work and operate in very different areas of our culture that perhaps any individual may not be as familiar with. So, for example, we bring together leaders that are in the education sector, with government leaders, with people in media, arts, politics, musicians, filmmakers, documentarians, technologists, people who are working on AI. And we put all these people in a room and we essentially say, let's learn from one another, because we know that we don't all have time to read the books. We don't always have time to engage every conversation. But if we can create a civil dialogue, if we can create a place where we respect one another, where each person comes in with humility, recognizing that they could learn from other people, then we can actually have really good conversations. And so we've done that at the smallest levels all the way up to thousands of people coming together for our events through THINQ. And so our THINQ Summit is essentially now our event that we do annually that allows leaders to come and learn. We do short 9-minute talks, and that creates conversations around tables and experiences for them, all meant to help all of us, and specifically our audience would be Christian leaders, understand how their faith applies to our current cultural moment and all the variety of controversial conversations and current issues that we're all trying to understand and better live into. And so that's the mission of THINQ, and thinkmedia.com is where we host a lot of that dialogue and also post a lot of the talks that allow people to go in and go a little deeper into the areas that are most familiar to them or that they have interest in.
So now you said you guys touch on some of the controversial topics, and obviously a show like this and writing a book on challenging conversations, this is definitely one of my heartbeats as well. When you throw in some of the biblical illiteracy, some of the issues that people are having, or just the concerns, or how disconcerted people are, or how divisive both sides of the aisle can be sometimes, what are some of those particular topics that you have found to be problematic? But in THINQ, you guys are really trying to get people together to have more of a biblical understanding with some of these issues.
Well, I think some of the latest ones, I mean, we just look at the last couple of years, discussions around sex, race, gender, politics, and elections. Those types of conversations tend to create the most anxiety for people because they're laden with people come into those with a clear set of beliefs in many cases, or they come in confused and
Mm-hmm.
they want to learn and they don't know who to listen to. And so we try to create spaces where there's trusted voices that allow people to go deeper into a topic and really get insights, not just debate, but actually more insights into why does someone think this? Where did that idea come from? Because we know there's not a lot of new ideas. They tend to just recirculate. And so we try to help people understand where ideas have come from that they're debating today. And then how does it apply to this moment? I will say the other conversations people this year in particular are wanting to talk a lot about is artificial intelligence, technology, moving into this digital age. What does faithfulness look like in the midst of that kind of an environment? What are the things we should walk away from and not participate in? And what are the areas where we should be creating and being a part
Mm-hmm.
of creating that future? And that becomes quite a debate amongst even Christians about what is the best way to be faithful in that moment.
You know, when you go back to your years, obviously doing this for, like you said, for quite some time, but also developing writing material with our friend David Kinnaman and covering some of like this growing generation among the millennials and Gen Z. And I know you and I have kids in those age demographics now. When I think of my two oldest, who are one of them's graduating college, and just seeing some of the conversations that he has had with his friends, a lot of them Christian or maybe a little progressive or grew up in a church but no longer. Some of them maybe are politically charged or one sided or one issue voter. What are some of the signs that you're seeing that are I don't want to label like as bad or let's put it this way, that are concerning to you among millennials and Gen Z, as many of them either go to the voting box or just their political views, but at the same time, what are some positive things, some encouraging things that you're seeing, Gabe, even as you've been charting these two generations that are getting older, that are helping to shape America for the better?
Well, I'll start with some of the discouraging parts that I think a
Yeah.
lot of us are recognizing, whether it's in our children or it's just in the environment that they're being nurtured in. Obviously, social media and technology has become a place that's allowed a lot of voices to have platform, even if those voices aren't educated, don't have any history with a particular topic. They just have a strong opinion. Sometimes that's just surfaced from their own lived experience, but not necessarily because it's grounded in an understanding that's really deep. And that type of environment, that is the culture. That's the air that our kids are breathing. And as they're breathing that air, it obviously influences them. It shapes them. We find that kids today are much more shaped by emotional stories. So when they hear someone's emotional appeal of a story that they've lived, sometimes
Hmm.
that can carry more weight as truth than actually something that's biblical. And so you always have to, as a parent, be pressing into that conversation to understand, well, what does God say about this, and what has history taught us about this? And I think those are the areas, as parents, as guides, as teachers, that we have to step into. So that's discouraging. I'd say the other thing that's discouraging is how much our children aren't getting access sometimes to some of the best voices and best thinking, because some of those ideas aren't being presented through the technology sources
Hmm.
and inputs that they're most likely to be receiving them through. That's a big part of how THINQ Media exists. We've tried to show up in these spaces, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, so that good ideas are also there competing with bad ideas. Because
Right.
our belief is that many times it's not that the person you disagree with is a bad person. It's many times they've just adopted an idea that's a bad idea. And so we make it a point to say, hey, let's debate ideas, not people. Let's understand that the person's identity is not this idea that they're maybe talking about or trying to persuade you towards, but that is just an idea. And so let's really debate the merits of the idea. I'd say on the encouraging front, the things that we're seeing that's so hopeful about the youngest generation is they are finally living through a cultural moment where they're going, what is the truth? Will you
Hmm.
please just tell me how I'm supposed to think about this? I'm getting so many mixed messages. I don't know who to trust. There's an opportunity for parents, there's an opportunity for teachers and guides and coaches and people that actually have the next generation think well about that particular cultural moment that we're living in. And I think their openness to those inputs, their openness to the older generation speaking into their life is more than what I know my generation was like as we were
Hmm.
growing up, Jason. I mean, we were
Hmm.
interested in what other people thought, but in some ways we felt disconnected from the older generation. I'm finding this generation reaching out, saying, I want mentoring. I'll invest the time. Will you just help me? Will you be a guide? Because I feel like they're understanding that things are a little more confused than perhaps what we thought of when we were their age.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's well put. Where oftentimes when you look at some of the negative or the progressive leaning that many of them have, let's say on abortion or drugs or legalization of marijuana or the border, they want borderless societies. I think, like you said, a lot of bad ideas have entered into them, and they are wanting to have a little bit more dialogue. And you are providing that through the Think organization, which I'm very appreciative through the years in our ministry and our efforts and seeing what you guys are doing to have those type of hard conversations, but to do it in a way where it's not just setting a stage where we can have them, but understanding ultimately what God's truth is and the benefit that that has in people's lives. And you and I certainly are seeing a resurgency among Gen Z, especially, that want to have these
Yeah.
conversations and want to be taught what the truth is. I just came from LA and Biola University, where there was a lot of non believers, but they're seeking and they're very cordial and very respectful. And I want people to be reminded of that, that they're not just hostile or they don't care. They actually do care. Which brings me to my
Well, there's
next thing. Go ahead.
I was just going to add one belief that I think has starting to see the end of its thinking amongst this generation has been the myth of progress. You know,
Right.
this idea that as we get older, as each generation passes, as we move from this year to next year, that everything gets smarter, that we all are making better decisions, that everything we're doing as a society is leading to human beings flourishing more. And in fact, I feel like more and more people are coming to the conclusion that, wait, I don't know if my life is better than my parents' life 20 years ago. I don't know if I am experiencing the flourishing that I thought I could. And that's good news for us, because when people kind of run into that dead end, they do
Mhm.
start to ask bigger and deeper questions. And one of the things, Jason, I'm encouraged about related to faith is starting to see some of the most intellectual people in our society, trusted voices, wise voices, starting to recognize God, starting to recognize
Right.
Jesus Christ, starting to speak to these things. I think of people like Russell Brand or Jordan Peterson, or many, many others who
Mhm.
could be new to faith, but they've been very honest about the spiritual component of life that's not measurable by science. And I think we're seeing a movement amongst the new atheist that for years was gaining traction, that now starting to peter out to where some of those leaders are now even recognizing that there must be a God. We're starting to see the science, the neuroscience, it's all pointing to the fact that we're divinely created, that there is a design to how we function. And when you're starting to hear voices talk about that, we haven't heard that group talk about this, the intellectual, the academic, those who
Mhm.
are well studied. It's been almost 50 years since we've seen this type of resurgence of belief in God. And so these are the encouraging components. As a new generation's looking for faith, some of the trusted voices are starting to come to faith. And so I think it's a beautiful thing to watch, to see what is God even doing in this moment where there is such division and polarization, but there's also that bigger question: where do I find meaning and purpose? And people are coming to conclusions that what the world's been feeding them, what secularism has tried to replace God with, is not working out.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, just a few episodes ago, we had our friend Justin Brierley, who wrote a book again regarding this, like you said, a kind of a resurgency to belief in God. Doesn't mean that they're becoming a full-on theist or a believer in God's word or Christ, but it's a move in the right direction. And we're seeing that in the academic space, particularly science. You mentioned earlier Joe Rogan, for example, when having Jordan Peterson and others like them having these dialogue. Of course, he says he's more of an agnostic. Maybe sometimes he'll say he's an atheist, but he's willing to have these type of conversations where, again, massive amount of young people. Logan Paul professes to be a Christian, but he has some issues and some takes on different things that if he was mentored and discipled, I think that he would probably see the truth of it, more clearly than he does right now. But he has voices on, and they're willing to have those kind of dialogues, which I think is special. Which does bring me to this other thing, which I was so appreciative that you did. I was preparing for the show, and I was on your website, and I watched this video titled "How to Think Well." And the reason, Gabe, that I really like this is because when I was studying and writing my book a few years ago, being a rhetorician. Now, I know like a lot of the political spectrum, like even right now with this attempted assassination of former President Trump again, they're always like the temperature's too high. We got to lower the rhetoric, lower the rhetoric. And oftentimes they're using it in a bad way. But if we go to the classic case, this was about critiquing like pure reason, having dialogue, understanding things, bringing in like Aristotelian logic of making somebody living a holistic life in connection to reality and also that which transcends reality, their connection to a divine power, i.e., God. And you have this video on the front end of your homepage, and you talk about this 5-part think rubric. Can you kind of lay this out for us? Because I think this speaks to a lot of these issues that we're seeing today, where a lot of times people are one-sided, one-dimensional type of person, or they're self-indulgent, or they don't care, or they got their head in the sand. And yet your approach was like, hey guys, this is important for us to be able to process not just information, but how it transforms us, so it could be, we could advance ourselves for the betterment of society. So can you talk on that video and why you put it out?
Well, Jason, I think what we have found is the critical thinking ability of a lot of us has gotten challenged in a time where our attention spans are low.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting bombarded with information. We don't know what sources to trust. And so what we wanted to do is really simplify for people, especially for Christians. How do you think well about the variety of topics that we can't even know are coming in the future? How do we apply a rubric that's going to stand up over time? And so we went back to the basics, and even our brand THINQ is spelled THINQ. And the reason is because this rubric THINQ is something I want every single person to memorize. I want our kids, our teenagers, people who are walking into the world today trying to figure out, how am I going to think about this well? Hopefully they can remember it very simply. And the T stands for theology. It says for a Christian, we start with, what is God's view of this matter? What does God's word say about this matter? What can we learn from church history about this matter, the way other leaders have come before us and tried to discern and understand what the Spirit of God would say about this particular topic? I found a long time ago, there's so many issues that we think are new issues today, but they're not. The church has dealt with them over time. Scripture deals with them perhaps in different ways than maybe we would assume. But how do we get really good at discerning what is God's view of this matter? And we start there. That's how we get to truth. The H then stands for history. We talked about this earlier. The history of ideas. Where did this idea come from? Is this a new idea? The history of events. What have led up to this moment, to why we think about this in such a way? And so we want to come at any issue by understanding the theology, God's view, the history, and then the I really is about posture. It's about inquiry and curiosity. How can I learn from people that may not be Christians? Just because I'm a Christian doesn't mean I'm the smartest person in the room on this. Who are the smarter people that have delved into this subject, that have studied it, that have done the scientific work, that can report back the research on, this is what we're learning about human beings and how we're functioning in society? So inquiry is an important part of thinking well. And then the end speaks to more of our posture in conversation with people. How do we have nuance in how we're both explaining the ideas that we believe so profoundly and we're convicted about, but also listening to other people's point of view? And how do we do that with nuance, so that we're not simply there telling people what we think, but we're also able to observe, listen, to hear the story that's coming at us and their experience and what their view is. And so we want to certainly persuade people towards wisdom and towards truth. But I think in our environment today, it's so important that we do that in such a way that's loving, that's kind, that actually allows people to also have a voice in the conversation. And then finally, it leads to the Q, which stands for questions, meaning, what's a better question that we can ask when we've actually thought through this rubric from a Christian worldview and a Christian point of view? How do we ask a better question than perhaps the world might be asking about this particular topic? And of course, asking questions was the way Jesus operated in the world. He asked over 300 questions in his ministry. It was the dominant way in which he provoked great conversation, learning, people discovering new truths and new wisdom. And so we should be some of the best question askers, because we've thought well about a topic and there's a better question that the culture's not asking right now about that particular topic. So that's the goal of THINQ. That's the mission of that series. And that series, by the way, is available for anybody to go watch it in less than 60 minutes. You, a student, your teenager, if you lead a classroom, I mean, this is simply made for people to be able to learn how to think well and critically think in a very simple format.
So when you take those five, and I really like that, do you apply those to those controversial subject matters like we talked about before, about like sex, let's say for example, or abortion, or the border
Yeah.
security or borderless society?
So some of those topics, yes, we have very specific talks that are walking people through the THINQ. We're doing more and more of that now as our conferences happen, as we're recording more and more content. A lot of the talks that we've curated that are part of THINQ Media, there's hundreds of them, by the way, on a variety of topics, were all part of the events we did leading up to branding ourselves THINQ. So they don't all have the THINQ working through the talk, but we're doing a lot to create resources now, especially as we move into the college space, where we have tons of college students now learning the THINQ rubric, to where we're doing the work now to apply that. And so certainly when I have conversations with people, I'm applying it to these different types of topics, whether it's artificial intelligence or sex and gender. But if you go to the website right now, you wouldn't necessarily be able to watch a talk that's THINQ on each of these topics. But in the future, that's the exact kind of resources we are developing.
But I like that too, because like you said, because you're going back to what does the Bible teach, and then extrapolating that through proper doctrine and understanding of it as we flush it out, giving historical references to that. And then everyone does sometimes when they're searching on Google or they're looking on a take, what does a Christian think about this? Or they pre-assume, like their presuppositional idea of what Christians think about something. But there are some of those inquiries that they have that it may not be as prevalent as it is in others. And then, like you said, even those nuances, or they feel
Yeah.
safe to ask certain type of questions, or how you guys can say, this is how we should ask the question, like abortion, for example. I think I saw one of the videos with you guys, and something certainly we do through the ministry is, well, what is it in the life of in the womb? Like the question is, that. Like, let's get to the heart of
Yeah.
it. And that's a helpful way to kind of reframe or restructure the conversation to, and sometimes avoid it being heated. So I think that's a good way of processing it. So obviously, as we're recording this, we are definitely in an election cycle for the president, the next president of the United States. And you guys, obviously, like you said, you have for years with these think tanks, so to speak, getting different minds, different people together, are having them articulate important issues that are either going to make or break not just America as a whole, but in communities. So I'd like to dive into a challenging topic, obviously pertaining to politics, because I'm sure you, Gabe, have in your family, depending on the individual, like I do in my family, we don't agree on everything, and that's fine. And that's not the aim is for us to agree on everything with the people that we love. But we oftentimes see people either avoid having conversations because it gets too heated, or they get embarrassed, or they say, well, what if they bring this up? I don't know what to say. I don't want to look like an idiot. So they avoid it altogether. But you guys, like you were mentioning earlier, are developing resources to literally bridge the gap to this divide. So, what are some of the specific things that you guys are doing, and also leading into this launch? That's why
Yeah.
I wanted to definitely on this platform talk about it to all of our people at the Washington Times, etc., about what you guys are doing to help homes take your material to learn how to be more effective in having conversations about politics in general.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason. I mean, I think what many of us realize is missing in the current social fabric is space to even have these kinds of conversations like you and I are having. We hear a lot of inputs, we hear a lot of one directional commentary that does shape how we're thinking, but we don't always have this space to process. And so, what we've done at THINQ is we've created an environment where during the month of October, anyone can do this. There's no cost. We simply are asking for a donation of any kind. Give $1 if you can. But what it allows people to do is actually sit in their living room, pull together their kids. Maybe they have adult children. Maybe it's just their friends and family. Maybe they're part of a church that has a community group or a small group. And they say, sometime in the month of October, we're going to create an evening to have a dialogue about this
Mm,
election and what does it mean to be faithful. So we call it Let's Talk Politics. And as we're not supposed to talk about politics and religion. Well, that's part of the problem.
yeah.
No one knows how to talk about politics and religion. And so we've curated 5 different talks that on that particular evening, these talks are about 9 minutes in length. So they're short, couple hours. What it allows people to do is pull up the THINQ Media Smart TV app, get that going on their television. They can watch one of these 9 minute talks and then have a dialogue about it. We're
Mm,
providing you with a few questions, and it allows you to have a discourse. And I'll say the topics that we're addressing do kind of rise above the noise, the fevered pitch of a
yeah.
election cycle, and help people think well about what does it mean to just be faithful every election? What does it mean to be a citizen here in America? How do I think well about my vote? How do I think about our children and the policies and the ways in which policy affects our children? So we have people like Oz Guinness, who's a social critic and somebody who's really studied histories and civilization, speaking to that. We've got W.B. Allen, one of the great noted political scientists, somebody
Hmm.
who studied George Washington in depth, a great scholar on him, talking about, are we a democracy or a republic? And all this discussion around a threat to our democracy. What does that even mean?
Right.
And what does it mean to show up in that kind of a space? We have Katie Faust as one of the talks talking about taking this lens on children and how do we think through the lens of how policies are impacting children in our politics. I give a talk that's specifically about how do we build the future beyond November 5th. So when we all wake up November 6th and whoever the executive is in
Hmm.
that office, is anything going to really change that much? I mean, certainly there's an environmental change and things do change. But at a core level, we're in the midst of a pretty big civilizational crisis. There's a breakdown happening that's much bigger than just this political moment. And I'm encouraging families and leaders and people who care a lot about building their family and building their community to know how to build that future so that as people are looking for a bit of a haven in the midst of that crisis, they will find that. They'll find that in communities that are strong, that trust one another, that are
Hmm.
resilient, both emotionally and physically, so that as we move through a season that many predict, I think of like The Fourth Turning is Here, a book by Neil Ho, who describes this
Hmm.
80-year cycle. He would say we're in that cycle. Like basically there's a social breakdown, there's economic breakdown, there's distrust in institutions. And when you're walking through that kind of a moment, how can we be the kinds of people that are here to help people
Hmm.
walk through that moment, even when it gets tough economically. And so those are the kind of conversations we want to create that really expand our vision of an election season and allow people to walk through that with hope about the future and also confidence that they're thinking well about how to navigate it. So people can learn about that. If you don't mind me saying it, thinkmedia.com/talkpolitics. If you go there, you can hear a short description of this. You could share it with your friends, neighbors, family members, church leaders, and recommend that they make a commitment in the coming months to be the kind of leader that's going to create space for conversation that leads to wisdom. This is, I think, the
Hmm.
most countercultural thing we can do, not just sit and watch television, Twitter, Instagram, and a bunch of opinions, but say, no, I want to create space to talk. So Let's Talk Politics is designed just for that.
Love it. I mean, I think we need to do more about this. This is why I'm excited about this. And we oftentimes don't have like a call to action like this, but this is so needed. I mean, when I was even putting together talks as you and I do regularly on this whole issue of politics, you're always going to have a base who says, that's none of our business, stay out of it. Other people are freaking out if they mention anything, they're going to lose their 501c3. A lot of people just have these bad views, or I call it sometimes a bad take or a bad interpretation. And so what you guys are doing is saying, look, you bring in some amazing experts, like you said, it's very non-threatening in your home. Download the Think Media app, watch them. You said there's 5 of them, and work through them and have discussions. Now, one thing I want to do in closing is we have a lot of pastors who contact us who will check out even the article that we'll do posting after this show, Gabe, who are struggling themselves. So in one sense, it's like, hey, do this in your home. How can, and the one thing I love about you too, as I've gotten to know you a bit, is your heart for the church.
Yeah.
You and I can have these organizations to come alongside the church to help equip the family. But how can a pastor right now listening, they're overwhelmed, they got issues going on, they know that they need to address this, but they don't know how to, again, either fear because they have a bad take about something. If I do this, then half the congregation is going to leave, they're going to stop tithing, or we got to stay out of it, it's none of our business, faith is private, whatever. Can you, in closing, Gabe, just speak to that pastor and then obviously remind them how they can utilize the resources that your ministry is providing for them?
Yeah, well, thank you, Jason. I mean, I do think you're right. The pastor many times gets put in this position where they're supposed to be the expert on every topic,
Hmm.
every issue, every policy, and it's impossible. None of us can be that well educated on every single component. But I'll tell you what pastors can do, and the pastors that work with Think, they have become really good at this, and that's creating space for the conversation. So the same conversation I just described that can happen in a living room, we'll have churches, hundreds of churches, that in October have this opportunity to come together with their congregants and create an evening dialogue. And we'll have many that'll have a few hundred, 75, 50 that'll come and sit together in a room, and they'll watch these talks on the big screen. And they'll have a dialogue around tables as a church. Now, what this does for a pastor is a couple things. One, it removes this pressure that on a Sunday morning in every sermon in
Hmm.
October, that they have to speak to the election. It's nothing wrong with speaking to the moment that we're in as citizens and that we need to be faithful in it. But certainly every sermon can't be about this election. The second thing it does for them is allow them to tell their people, we've created space for conversation, because some things need a conversation, not just a sermon. And so by creating this evening, which this event is called Faithfulness in Our Political Moment, I would encourage people to go to thinkmedia.com. Remember, think with a Q, thinkmedia.com/local. And when you go to that link, you'll actually see Faithfulness in Our Political Moment, which allows you to then host this event, bring it to your church, and create a night anytime in the month of October. Many are going to do it October 3rd, but as they're listening to this, that's coming pretty quickly. Schedule it late in October. Schedule it the week before the election, but create space that you can tell your people, hey, we are going to have this conversation. And the same elevated discourse that we're creating in living rooms is going to be happening as well in churches and schools, in spaces where people are saying, we want to bring our people together to know that they have a place in this conversation, to sit with one another and to learn from one another. In addition to that, I just want to say, after the election, I would love every pastor to know that Think Media exists to provide the best talks that start conversations. So when we were talking about the Think rubric, how do I think well? Many times what people do is they listen to a talk and then they go through that exercise as a community themselves. They go, okay, now what does God's word say about
Hmm.
mental health? What does history teach us about the way human beings respond to anxiety, to panic? I'm just applying it to mental health. And then we inquire of what are the great sources that we can all learn from that'll help us with the neuroscience of mental health and some of what's happening in our current community. And then we move into the nuance of conversation. We ask a better question. What does it mean to have a renewed mind? How do we create environments that do that? How do we limit our technology use so that we can do that? In January, Jason, just quickly, I'll say probably over 1,000 churches will be participating in the THINQ digital fast. Now, this is something that many have read, Jonathan Haidt's work, Anxious Generation, that describes the mental health crisis. So in response, we have hundreds of churches already signed up to do a digital fast for 28 days. 28 days, they're going to challenge their congregations during January to use their phones as a utility device versus a social media device. And so we have a very specific pathway over 28 days that these churches and all their congregants will go through. We've done it in our local church for over 2 years now. It's been amazing because it's bringing parents and kids together. It's the kind of thing that none of us on our own are that disciplined to probably do well. But when our whole family's doing it, when our community is doing it, when our whole church is doing it, now we can do this collective action activity that actually helps us have better mental health and much better clarity about the role we need to play by being present in our families and in our communities. So these are just some quick examples of all the many ways that THINQ comes alongside churches and leaders to try to take these ideas that sometimes feel lofty and scholarly and academic, but we bring them to the ground level so that all of us can benefit from them.
And I could vouch for that just as we're closing. And I want to appreciate, Gabe, you coming on and this call to action for the parents listening, the grandparents, or the individual. If you're a college student, you guys can go to thinkmedia.com and you'll see there the faithfulness in our political moment, Thursday, October 3rd, 2024. But as Gabe said, you could do it anytime that your schedule allows, sometime before the election. And it says, in a chaotic election season, lead a critical conversation to rise above the noise. Join hundreds of churches across America, you guys. You can go to thinkmedia.com. Gabe, I appreciate the work you're doing. I vouch for it personally. I've been enriched by many of the resources that you provided through the years. And even just seeing the last 2 years, this growth of THINQ Media is phenomenal. And I do believe that the Holy Spirit will continue to use it and not just equip individuals and families, but through your efforts and your team and these churches that are partnering, that we will see a massive change of people turning to the gospel. So I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Jason. It's great having this dialogue with you. Keep up the great work to create more spaces like this.
Well, my friends, we are thankful for Gabe. We're thankful for him coming on and being a part of all the work that he's doing. So make sure you guys go to thinkmedia.com. If this ministry, this podcast is helping you stand strong in your faith and have those challenging conversations, make sure that you leave us a review and also check out all the resources that we make available on Higher Ground Times and also the Washington Times. You can also go to standstrongministries.org, where we have a bunch of resources available, as well as sending out a newsletter teaching you guys and showing you guys how to get involved with THINQ Media. That will be coming out shortly. So thanks for watching. Until next time, keep having those challenging conversations.